What's going on, bibliophiles? Welcome back to Poetry and Prejudice. If you are new here, my name is Barry Ramirez. Welcome to the channel, and thank you sincerely for watching. So I'm coming at you guys a second time today. I keep saying this about this channel, but I have yet to fulfill my promise, but I'm being sincere this time. I want to put out these videos a little bit more frequently, especially these poem readings that I do. So for those who are unfamiliar with what I'm doing here, I kind of read one poem all the way through, and then I kind of go through and break down the poem line by line, giving my best possible interpretation and try along the way to capture and articulate what literary devices the poet is using to convey their theme or their message, so that you guys can read along in a kind of informal way, listen along, and also so that you guys could potentially disagree with me. That would be great. Down in the comments below, if you guys tell me if you agree or disagree with my analysis. But let's go ahead and crack into the reading here. This is a poem called Living in Sin by a great American poet named Adrienne Rich, one of my favorite American poets. This is one of her earlier poems, which I think just speaks to her genius. I think this was one of the poems she actually had in her first collection of poems, which went on to win the Yale Younger Poets Prize, which, for those of you who don't know, is the most prestigious prize you can win for a collection of poetry, your first collection of poetry, I should say. But you're going to see precisely the depth of her genius here. So with that said, let's go ahead and read the poem one time through, and then we'll go through and break it down line by line. She had thought the studio would keep itself, no dust upon the furniture of love. Half heresy to wish the taps less vocal, the panes relieved of grime. A plate of pears, a piano with a Persian shawl, a cat stalking the picturesque, amusing mouse had risen at his urging. Not that at 5 each separate stair would writhe under the milkman's tramp. That morning light so coldly would delineate the scraps of last night's cheese and 3 sepulchral bottles, that on the kitchen shelf, among the saucers, a pair of beetle eyes would fix her own, envoy from some village in the moldings. Meanwhile, he, with a yawn, sounded a dozen notes upon the keyboard, declared it out of tune, shrugged at the mirror, rubbed at his beard, went out for cigarettes, while she, jeered by the minor demons, pulled back the sheets and made the table and found a towel to dust the tabletop and let the coffee pot boil over on the stove. By evening, she was back in love again, though not so wholly, but throughout the night she woke sometimes to feel the daylight coming like a relentless milkman up the stairs. So let's go ahead and take this line by line here. So first thing to note here is the poem is being told, so to speak, in third person. The poem is about, I presume, a woman, given that the pronoun she is being used, and her relationship, if you want to call it a relationship, and this is, there's room for speculation here, the nature precisely of this relationship, with a man who is described as the milkman. But more on that in a moment. Let's just take it from the first line. First line is, she had thought the studio would keep itself. Now, this is a very simple sentence, but there's a lot of information here. We know who is being talked about. There is a she, and we know that this she lives in a studio. So a studio is a smaller apartment. I believe, I could be incorrect about this, but I believe it's just a one-room apartment. And I don't believe it even has a shower and a bathroom. I could be wrong about that. But despite that, the idea is that it is a very, very small apartment, one where you could assume that the person living there doesn't have very much money, because if you did, why would you live in a studio, right? So I assume, to a certain extent, that this woman lives alone. Now, here again, there's room for speculation as to why it is that she's living alone. I have thoughts about this, and I'll tell you what they are as we go along and why it is that I think them. But, excuse me, I believe that this is a woman who is in a relationship with a man and who is having an affair. Now, this can be slightly inferred from the second line here. So the speaker says, "No dust upon the furniture of love. She had thought the studio would keep itself. No dust upon the furniture of love." So it's almost like there's kind of two things going on here. There's the physical space, which is being described, right? There's no dust upon the furniture in the studio itself. She wouldn't have to actually actively clean it, but there's also something almost symbolic going on here. The furniture is described as the furniture of love. So you get the sense here that this woman thought in some way that the relationship that she's in, this is my best interpretation, the relationship that she was in would in some way keep itself, that it wouldn't become dirty. It wouldn't be, it wouldn't become dirty. It wouldn't become covered with dust if it was left to its own devices, if it was left by itself. Now, I imagine it that I don't know the exact nature of the relationship, and part of the reason why this poem is so pleasurable to read is because it is ambiguous. But I imagine it that the man that she's in a relationship with is away for some reason. Maybe it's because he lives in another town. Maybe it's because he has a job that takes him away. Maybe he's a truck driver. Maybe he's in the military. We don't necessarily know. But the idea is that they are apart from each other, and the relationship will not keep itself. It's not going to keep itself clean without some effort. And this woman here thought that it would. Now what starts to happen in the poem is that what starts to be revealed is kind of the psychological space of a woman who is having an affair. So you'll see that she almost wishes that the place that she was living in, she almost wants it to be dirty because she sees that as a reflection of herself morally, so to speak, because she knows that what she is doing is morally wrong in that she is having an affair. So you'll see here the speaker says, "Half heresy to wish the taps less vocal, the pains relieved of grime." So heresy, to engage in heresy is to contradict, so to speak, religious orthodoxy. So in this case, it's almost like heretical for her to wish the taps less vocal. In other words, when she turns on the taps, say, for example, in the sink or in the shower, they make a lot of noise. So we get the sense that the pipes are a bit older. And here it says it's half heresy for her to wish that they weren't that way. Why? Well, because psychologically speaking, she herself is kind of run down. Morally speaking, she is run down. So for her to wish to live in a place that was better would not be congruent with her moral behavior, if that makes sense. She deserves to live somewhere that is poor and run down because she herself is immoral. And there's the same thing going on here in the next line. To wish the taps less vocal, the panes relieved of grime. Why should the windows not be dirty when she herself is dirty, morally speaking? Now, what happens here is that there's kind of this description of some parts of the studio. A plate of pears, a piano with a Persian shawl, a cat stalking the picturesque amusing mouse had risen at his urging. So there's a little bit of ambiguity going on here that's been always something that's kind of like difficult for me to really ascertain, but I think I have a good sense. So there's a plate of pears. So you just would imagine that being something that's kind of on the counter. A plate of pears, a piano with a Persian shawl. Those just seem to me to be objective descriptions. There's a piano. The piano has a shawl over the top of it. And then there's a cat stalking the picturesque amusing mouse had risen at his urging. Now, this part is the part that's really ambiguous for me. So I can't tell whether there's an actual cat in the studio apartment, although that would be That would not be any way surprising because this is a woman living alone. It's very common for women who live alone to have cats. But it might be the case that this is just a description of, for example, like a painting, or it might be, like one of those plates that have a painting on them, right? A cat stalking the picturesque, amusing mouse. So there's almost like this image of a cat stalking a mouse, and that could be like a cartoonish one on a plate. That's what I'm imagining in my head. Had risen at his urging, right? So we have the idea here, the mouse is like rising up because the cat is coming after it. Moving on here, not that at 5, each separate stair would writhe under the milkman's tramp. Now, this is the line that seems to me to communicate the most clearly that this woman is engaged in an affair. Here's why. So we have this idea that at 5, so this is kind of like almost after the work day towards the evening, you have this man coming up the stairs. Now, the stairs are personified because they are described here as writhing, which means almost to like contort or convort. Is that a word? I think contort is a word, but that's not what I mean. To contort in almost in pain. So why would they be described that way? Because once again, I think there is this reflection of the woman's psychology, right? The physical place that she is in is almost becoming a manifestation also of like her moral place, if you will, or her moral standpoint. So she hears this man coming up the stairs. They're going to do what they're going to do. And there's some pain associated with that because she knows that she's, in my opinion, behaving immorally. Now, the reason why I think that this is an affair is this last phrase, under the milkman's tramp. Now, there's this common saying, at least here in America, I don't know where it is that you guys are listening from, but there's this kind of like common saying that, if somebody doesn't know where their baby came from, you always say something like, oh, it was the mailman, right? So that's kind of like a running joke. So for example, like my best friend, his father used to always make the joke that his son was I almost said the milkman's. His son was the mailman's. The idea is that the mailman had an affair with his wife and had his son because they didn't look alike, right? I think that that's the kind of thing that's being said here. In this case, it's not the mailman, it's the milkman, which might have been something that was said around the time that this poem was written, because once upon a time, the milkman actually did deliver milk, right? So then we have this interesting leap in time here, which for a long time escaped me when I was reading this poem. But we have this instance where the milkman is tramping up the stairs at 5, and then we jump to the morning. So the next line here is, that morning light so coldly would delineate the scraps of last night's cheese and 3 sepulchral bottles. So we go from 5 to the morning. What happened in between that time? Oh yeah, the nasty is what happened during that time, in my opinion. So that morning light so coldly would delineate the scraps of last night's cheese and 3 sepulchral bottle. So when the morning light comes in, you see kind of what's left over from the evening. And in this case, we have what we would probably broadly call hors d'oeuvres, right? There's cheese and there's 3 sepulchral bottles. There's cheese and there's wine. So this is the kind of thing that you would have for a guest, not necessarily for someone who you were, I don't know if this is misreading it here, but somebody who you are interested in having a long-term romantic relationship with. It would seem like what would be more appropriate in that context would be like a full meal, right? She would cook a meal for someone that she was interested in having for a long-term relationship, whereas this seems to be the kind of like, oh yeah, here's a little bit of snacks, let's get a little bit tipsy, and then let's have some sex. That's what it seems to be to me. So continuing on, there is once again this description of the apartment, and in this case it gets more and more grimy. What's happening? Once again, the outer is becoming a reflection of the inner. That on the kitchen shelf, among the saucers, a pair of beetle eyes would fix her own, envoy from some village in the moldings, right? So the beetle eyes. This could be a beetle of any kind. We don't necessarily know. It's not specified. I like to think of it as a cockroach, and I think that that is in keeping with the general dirtiness of this studio apartment. It also is just an accurate reflection of her moral character. So I imagine almost like she can see a cockroach, and the cockroach is almost staring at her. Of course, I think cockroaches are blind. I don't really know much about cockroaches, but that's the idea. The cockroach is like looking at her, fixing her own. They're like looking at each other, and they're kind of like recognizing themselves in each other. Might be a stretch there, might be a stretch, but I think that I'm onto something. Envoy from some village in the moldings. That's just an interesting phrase. The idea is, of course, there's a village, a village of cockroaches that are living inside the walls. Also speaks to the kind of rundownness of this studio apartment complex. Meanwhile, he, with a yawn, sounded a dozen notes upon the keyboard, declared it out of tune, shrugged at the mirror, rubbed at his beard, and went out for cigarettes, right? So, very interesting description of this man. This is kind of really the only description we get of him, but it tells us quite a bit. Meanwhile, he, with a yawn, sounded a dozen notes upon the keyboard. So what is he doing there? He's kind of like yawning. He's almost bored. And that seems to be probably an accurate reflection of what he's doing in the first place, right? He's probably just having an affair, probably just having sex because he's bored. He, with a yawn, sounded a dozen notes upon the keyboard. So he's just like sitting there diddling on the keyboard. He doesn't necessarily even know how to play. He's just doing something to keep active. He's like, it's out of tune. And then he looks at himself in the mirror. He shrugs. Like, you get the sense that this is the kind of guy who doesn't necessarily care very much for his appearance, which is further exemplified by him kind of like rubbing at his beard. He's like, I'm unshaven in all likelihood. He doesn't look clean cut. He doesn't seem to really give a fuck. And then he dips out to go get cigarettes, right? Once again, of course, smoking cigarettes does not necessarily mean that you are a bad person or immoral. But generally speaking, people who smoke cigarettes tend to be more risky, which is in line or in keeping with a character who would be engaging in an affair with a woman who is in a committed relationship. Now, while he's gone, we have her having to live with what it is that she's done. While she, jeered by the minor demons, right? Jeered. It's almost like her demons are like almost making fun of her, right? Look at what you've done. Her minor demons. The minor demons being her sins in this case. Jeered by the minor demons, she pulled back the sheets and made the bed and found a towel to dust the tabletop, right? She pulled back the sheets, made the bed, and found a towel to dust the table off. She pulled back the sheets. This is very interesting because as I'm reading this, I think that I always read this differently before. I imagined her as like making the bed because the sheets were all in a mess from them, their raucous lovemaking, so to speak. But it might be now that they never even pulled out the sheets in the first place. Seems to me like they might have just actually done what they were doing on top of the sheets. Maybe they were in a tussle. One way or the other, she makes the bed and she finds that there's a towel to dust the tabletop, right? So again, she realized that she's done something immoral, and now she's acting out in such a way that is a way for her to kind of like, in an odd way, clear her conscience, right? She's trying to almost clear her conscience by cleaning her physical space. This is a thing that's really common for human beings. I'm sure that some of you have actually done this before. I found myself, when I feel extraordinarily unorganized, just as an example, that one way that I can make myself feel organized, even though it doesn't necessarily change anything, is actually by cleaning my house. As soon as I clean my house, I've kind of like psychologically relieved that pressure, that feeling, that tension of being unorganized. Here she seems to be doing something very, very familiar in that way. She's kind of like cleaning things to help herself feel clean psychologically from committing adultery, from having an affair. and let the table, and let the coffee pot boil over on the stove. So it's almost like she set the coffee and she's so psychologically involved in what it is that she's doing and probably thinking and rethinking, feeling shame, trying to convince herself that she shouldn't feel shame. There's probably all of this churning around in her mind, so much so that she forgets that she has the coffee on the stove and it's boiling. It starts to boil over, right? She's just too involved with herself at the moment. By evening, she was back in love again. Now, here once again, this is why I think that this is a poem about a woman who is having an affair. By evening, she was back in love again. Well, the question is, back in love with whom? Like, back in love with this guy? I don't think so. The guy who took off to go get cigarettes, I don't think that that's the person that she's back in love with again. I think she is back in love with the person who she has cheated on, right? Or at least she's come to convince herself that she's still in love with that person, even though she's done what she has done. She's back in love again, but there's an exception made here. Though not so wholly. In other words, not so completely. So she's still in love, but that love, such as it is, has been damaged and tainted likely forever, because the sanctity, so to speak, of the relationship has been ruined. Now, she might be able to convince herself that she's still in love with him, but she's always going to have that in the back of her mind that she has cheated on him, and it's going to taint things. It's going to taint them. Though not so wholly, but throughout the night she woke sometimes to feel the daylight coming, like a relentless milkman coming up the stairs. So throughout the night she woke sometimes. So you almost have this idea of the woman like waking up almost as if she's having a nightmare. And the nightmare that she is having is of the daylight coming and this like a relentless milkman coming up the stairs. So this is another one of the lines in the poem that has always been difficult for me to really kind of like ascertain its meaning and understand its relationship to the theme, I should say. It seems to me like there's just kind of like that image or that idea that she might be stuck in a position where, like she got caught cheating, right? So she's like wakes up one morning and there's kind of like the milkman's coming up the stairs, and she gets caught with her husband there. I don't know. This particular line is really, really difficult for me. But what's clear is that there's something almost nightmarish about it. And that's what seems to be like the primary thing that's trying to be communicated here. Something nightmarish about her waking up and realizing that she has had this affair. I swear I can speak. I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Tell me what you guys think about my interpretation and analysis down in the description below. I'd like to hear in particular what you guys think of those last two lines and how you understand those last two lines in relationship to the rest of the poem, and in particular the relationship to the theme. So before you go, I just want to say, I announced this in a previous video, but I just published my first collection of poetry. It is a chapbook called Pebbles of Light. So if you would like to support me and support this channel, I would greatly appreciate it if you made a purchase, which you can do so in the link in the description below. So that'll take you on over to Amazon. There's two options. You can purchase the book as an ebook, download it immediately onto your Kindle or your electronic device for the price of $10. Or if you're somebody like me and you prefer to have a book in your hand, you can also purchase the paperback version. It is $12, but they charge a little bit extra for the printing cost. I think it takes about 3 or 4 days for them actually to print and ship it out, but both of those options are there for you. So once again, just please consider making a purchase if you would like to support me and support this channel. Otherwise, if you enjoyed this content, hit that like button, smash subscribe, hit the notification bell so you can be informed when I drop more videos on poetry and prejudice. Until next time, guys.